Bonjour, welcome to Wahsa Distance Education Center's radio Zoom classes. This is SVN3E, Grade 11 Workplace Science, and I'm the teacher, Bronwyn Slate. If you'd like to participate live today, you can call the Wahsa studio at 1-800-465-7144 or 737-4017. You can listen on the radio at 91.9 FM and also on the television at Bell Express View, channel 972. You are always welcome to join me live through the Zoom link, which is available from me, your teacher, and also your DEC. Our classes are scheduled from Monday through Thursday from 10 to 11 in the morning, and we are in our second week of our 9-week course. A reminder of what work to submit for marking when you are ready. The key questions are listed at the end of each of your IL lesson, and so you need to do all of these questions. Some of them are check your understanding questions, some of them are activities, and some of them are review questions. So please do all of them, explaining all of your ideas and your thoughts in complete sentences. Make sure you're actually answering the question and giving me a full description of what you understand. You can do this by hand or electronically. If you want to write in your workbook, you can, though the space is not very large, so I wouldn't really encourage it unless you just wanted to make notes. However, you can also do it electronically. Word and Google Doc files are the easiest ones for me to open. If you don't have easily access to those, everyone does have access to Google Doc through their NNEC email address, but if you're not sure how to do that, let me know and I can support you. Or if you need to use a different file type, I'm sure it's fine. Just let me know so that we can make sure that I can open your files some way or another. So then how do you submit your work for marking? So there's 3 different ways. The first is to send your work in electronically. So you can scan your work if you've done it by hand. And if you have a device, most devices have a pretty straightforward way of scanning. Apple devices come with a Notes app and it has a scan function. And Android devices generally come with a Google Drive app and it also has a scan function. These are both free apps. If you don't have them on your device, you can look to download them. And then pretty much it's a point and click sort of situation that scans that information. If you do need to send me a picture, it's okay to send me a picture. The files are just a little bit bigger and more awkward, but it's totally okay. I can still manage it. Then send it to me either through email to studentwork@nnec.on.ca and CC it to bronwyn.slate@nnec.onca, or send it to me through Facebook Messenger at bslateWahsa. The second method is to drop your work off in Sioux Lookout. We have an outdoor mailbox at our location 74 Front Street. We are the bright red building next to the post office, and we have a small white mailbox next to our side entrance. We are not yet open to the public, hopefully soon, but not yet. So just put your work in that mailbox and I'll get it back to you as soon as I can. The third method is to hand your work into your DEC. Your DEC can then send your work through the Express or fax it to 807-737-1732 or toll-free fax to 1-800-463-7852. Students are also welcome to fax their work if you have access to a fax machine. That's not a problem. If you'd like to connect with me through Facebook and also YouTube, my name in both those locations are bslateWahsa. So if you friend me on Facebook and subscribe to my YouTube channel, then you get reminders or notifications when I upload one of our videos. All of our lessons are recorded and I upload them to YouTube shortly after airing, and I put them in a playlist called SVN3E, and I share that on Facebook so that it's really easy to find our lessons and watch the replays. I also put all of our supplementary videos that are in YouTube. I link them in a supplementary video list so you can access those again from their original sources if you're interested in doing so. Science is a really visual subject. I try to incorporate as many videos, charts, diagrams, images as I can. So I strongly encourage you to access the videos opposed to just listening. If you can't join me live through Zoom and you have unreliable internet and can't access the YouTube videos, let me know and I can send you a copy of the recordings so that you have a full experience of this course. If you have any questions, please contact me. Email is bronwyn.slate, which is spelled BRONWYN.SLATE, sorry, at nec.on.ca. My Facebook is bslate Wahsa. You can call me on the phone at the office at 807-737-1488, extension 2209, or toll free 1-800-667-3703. My office hours are Monday through Friday, 8 a.m. till 2 p.m., though I teach from 9 till 11 in the morning. So that's not a great time to get a hold of me, but leave me a message and I will get back to you as soon as possible. All right, I think it's really important to position myself within the context of this course. I have white settler ancestry, I have white privilege, and that has shaped the way that I experience education and also the way that I teach as an educator. I know that my white privilege has made my life within education as well as outside of education much easier and have less barriers than many other folks. I live in Northwestern Ontario on the traditional territories of the Anishinaabe people, and I am working to learn from this culture and these people around me, though it is a process. As an educator, I always will have lots to learn as well as unlearn. These are pretty systemic, ingrained systems that take time and active thought to deconstruct and disrupt. It is something that I'm working on, but I'm sure I still have a much longer journey to continue on. Our textbook is Eurocentric, I've noticed. It ignores Indigenous, Inuit, Métis knowledges and experiences. Many of the experiences and examples are based on white scientists and white communities. So the wealth of knowledge in non-white communities is ignored. It's not even considered, and those experiences are often not shared as well. This is really problematic, and I am hopeful to find a different resource, but there are not a lot of options out there. So it's a bit of a process. If anyone has any suggestions how either I can do better or might have a resource that might be a better resource, please feel free to share that with me. I'm happy to take that feedback and do better. All right, so we're continuing with Unit 2, Maintaining Healthy Ecosystems. In our last lesson, we talked about what ecosystems are and how they are interconnected. And today we're going to look at Lesson 5 and how carbon footprints measure the impact of human activities on the environment. So we talked about, our last class, we talked about how there are a great impact by human activities, but this is one method of measuring that so that we can see the individual impact that we have. So our learning goals are that at the end of this lesson, you'll be able to describe the meaning and implications of carbon footprints, and you'll be able to identify the connection between political, wealth, and carbon footprints. You have met the learning goals because you can define carbon footprints and explain who has the greatest impacts. You can explain climate injustices, and you can explain how carbon footprints can be reduced. Okay, so first off, I've just said carbon footprints about 10 times in the last 30 seconds. So what is a carbon footprint? So carbon footprints is the measure of amount of greenhouse gases, GHGs, emissions produced by an individual or a country. Burning fossil fuels and deforestation are primary causes of GHG emissions. Forests are thought of as carbon sinks because they remove and store carbon dioxide. We've talked about the carbon cycles and how plants and forests, trees specifically, take in large amounts of carbon in their process through photosynthesis and create food and energy for themselves. And so they're absorbing a lot of carbon, and they hold that in their bodies as they are growing and alive. But when they are cut down or burned, carbon dioxide is then released back into the air, changing forests into a carbon source. So this is part of why trees can be burned for fuel, is that carbon they contain. But once they are burned, then they are no longer holding on to that carbon, and that is released in the atmosphere, sorry, and contribute to greenhouse gas emissions. So back to carbon footprints, they're all measured using units called carbon dioxide equivalents. So they're not all measuring carbon dioxide. A carbon footprint doesn't just measure carbon dioxide, but carbon dioxide equivalents are what the unit of measurement that scientists use. So, and that's denoted by CO2e. So different greenhouse gases have different effects on the atmosphere. So we convert all of them to carbon dioxide equivalents to compare them. Same way that we often convert things into percentages to compare them. This way we know that we're comparing something similar opposed to something completely very vastly different, and then we don't get any information. So the mass of each greenhouse gas is converted to the mass of carbon dioxide that would give the same warming level over a 100-year period. You do not need to know how to actually convert. You're not going to have to be expected to convert various emissions into carbon dioxide equivalents, but just understanding what it is that's going on gives us some more information. Carbon dioxide equivalents are measured in tons or gigatons, so capital GT. This is a measurement, a large measurement. Tons isn't something that most of us are familiar with, but it's a lot. It's heavy. So here is a diagram from 2020 of global greenhouse gas emissions by sector. So this is global, so worldwide, and it's shown for the year 2016. It takes time for information to be gathered and processed and collected and analyzed. So though this was printed in 2020, the data is from 2016, so now 6 years ago, still fairly current. So the global greenhouse gas emissions were 49.9 billion tons carbon dioxide equivalent. And where did all that emissions come from? That's what this graph is showing us. So 73.2% was energy. This red part is all energy information. So that it breaks it down even further a little bit. So then energy use in industry was 24.2%, transportation was 16.2%, and energy use in buildings was 17.5%. So when we talk about individuals being able to have an impact, we want to think about this, not only energy use, but also where it's being used. Then there's also within energy, there's fuel combustion, energy production emissions, and energy in agriculture and fishing. All of those are part of energy, but they get smaller and smaller, you can see. So within like energy used in industry is 24.2%. That is something that we can't necessarily personally do change, but the products that we use, the companies that we support, the industries that we support, that is going to put money in the hands of those industries, which then might use more energy or less energy, depending on how we are using them. Whereas energy in buildings, which is 17.5%, so a smaller amount. Commercial is 6.6%, and residential buildings is 10.9%. So the idea of, well, if everybody would just turn off their lights when they're not using them in their homes, and that would have a great impact, yes, it would have an impact, but it's only 10.9% of the global greenhouse gas emission is from residential buildings. So yes, it still would have an impact, but if we are only focusing on that 10.9%, we are missing out on 89% of what else is going on. So it's really important to not just focus on one area. We need to focus on the area in general. So road transport is 11.9%, even like that's a little bit more than residential buildings. So thinking about how we use our car, would also have an impact opposed to just thinking about turning off the lights. Then other industries, so energy was is the largest. Then we have industry just in general, which is 5.2%. So they break that up into chemicals and cement. Waste, so landfills and wastewater is 3.2%, is where greenhouse gases emissions are coming from. And then agriculture, forestry, and land use is 18.4%. And that's broken down into livestock and manure, agricultural soils, rice cultivation and crop burning, deforestation, cropland, and then grasslands are broken up to see where those different amounts are being used. So it's just really interesting to think about where energy emissions are coming from, or greenhouse gas emissions are coming from, because it's not simple. It's not just from one place, and it's multiple industries, multiple ways that are contributing to this. And this is across the world, so we're doing it in different ways. All right, so now we're going to watch a video that explains carbon footprints pretty well, to just, again, understand how it's connected together.
The Simple Show explains the carbon footprint. This is you. You've probably been hearing a lot about climate change and how you should reduce your carbon footprint. But what is that exactly? Just like an actual footprint, it's a mark you leave upon the environment. No, not with your shoes, but with every action that releases carbons. Those are the harmful gases, such as CO2, which are pumped out by burning fossil fuels like oil or gas. The more fuel you use, the bigger your footprint will be. You may think that by driving your car, the only carbons you release come from the engine, but no. Consider the carbons that are emitted just to get fuel into the tank. From the energy needed to extract the oil from underground, the pollution caused by transportation and refinement, to the final delivery to your local petrol station. Not to mention the CO2 released by manufacturing your car in the first place. More than you thought, huh? So unless you live in a cave, you and everything you own has its own carbon footprint. Read a book? Printing and distributing. It uses energy. Brush your teeth, and your utensils will have a history in a factory. Even something as basic as an apple could have traveled hundreds or even thousands of polluting miles to end up in your local supermarket. You see, it's pretty much impossible to leave no carbon footprint behind, but that's no reason to stop trying. Think about your actions and choices, and you'll be able to reduce your personal mark after all. That's how you really put the boot into climate change.
So that gives you a little bit of understanding of where carbon footprints come from. You can now answer the questions on page 37, your check your understanding questions about carbon dioxide equivalents and carbon sink versus carbon source. So the next thing we wanted to look at is, what is your actual carbon footprint? Because again, this is a personal thing that is going to be different for each of us. So our carbon footprint is made up of two parts. So there's the primary footprint, which is the measurement of carbon dioxide emissions the human can control directly. So the carbon dioxide emissions come from burning fossil fuels, from cars, planes, factories. So those are the things that we are directly doing. And then there's also the secondary footprint, which is the measurements of carbon dioxide emissions in which humans have indirect control over. So this is the emissions come from production of products. So right now I'm sitting in a room with a computer, with a phone, with headphones, with speakers, with a water bottle, with a keyboard, all of these things, with a book, my shoes, my clothes, all of these things have been produced. And though right now they are not emitting carbon, they're not emitting greenhouse gas emissions, the production to create all of these things did. And so those would be part of my secondary footprint. So we have this resource, this online resource, which is what is your ecological footprint, and you can go through it and see what you actually calculate. So hopefully it's going to work for me today. Sometimes they don't. So I will link this into our show notes for in our YouTube lesson. But so this is footprintcalculator.org, and you can then go through and see, it tells you how many planets do we need if everybody lives like you. So right now, overall, Earth's overshoot day is July 28th. So that means that by July 28th, we have used up the equivalent of all of the resources um, for that year. And now we would need more Earths in order to continue uh, this if we were going to have a sustainable world. So, of course, we haven't actually used up all the resources. It's not like we can't exist now. We are existing. It is after July 28th, but it just means that that's shortening the long lifespan for future generations. So you can go through and answer all these questions. Again, you do them for yourselves, what makes most sense. So they ask you questions about food. How often do you eat animal-based products? Beef, pork, chicken, fish, eggs, dairy products. This also would be game if you are moose, deer, geese, things like that. And then you can go in even more specific and answer it in terms of if you never eat pork, then you can say never. If you eat poultry often, then you can say that or very often, then you can put it there. So you decide what works best for you. For me, I'm going to say that I probably often eat animal products, a meal a few times a week, almost daily. Probably that is realistic in my world. So then you click over here, and how much of the food that you eat is unprocessed, unpackaged, or locally grown. So this also would include if you are hunting, you would say that your food would be very much unprocessed, unpackaged, and locally grown. That would be true. But I would say probably most of my food is processed, packaged, and it's not locally grown is really the key. Most of our food comes from far away. So I'm just going to randomly pick a number and go for there. This is not an exact thing. It's all good. Housing type, what house best describes you? So freestanding, no running water, freestanding, running water, multi-story apartment, duplex, row house building with a couple of units, luxury condominium. I live in a freestanding home with running water. What material is your home constructed with? I honestly don't know, but I'm going to say that it is brick and concrete. Yeah. How many people live in your household? 3 people live in my household. And what size is your household? My household is would fit under medium, though it feels awfully small. But then you can go up to huge, which is so beyond what I imagine. So lots of options for huge, large, and just rough approximation. My house is under 100 or 1,000 square feet. It's okay if you don't do it exactly. Do you have electricity in your home? Yes, I do. How energy efficient is your home? I would say that it is above average. It is well insulated, has efficient lighting and appliances, and careful use is something we are really aware of. Then what percentage of your home's electricity comes from renewable sources? So directly or through purchased green power. So I would say that probably, I can't remember, but you can look this up in terms of hydro. I'm going to say 60% to just guess, but most of my energy comes from hydro. all of my energy really comes from hydro. So I'm going to say that that's a renewable source. So I'm going to say 80% just because I'm not exactly sure, but it's pretty high. Then compared to your neighbors, how much trash do you generate? I would say that it is less. You can then go in and be more specific if you like. How far do you travel by car or motorcycle each week as a driver or passenger? I don't drive by motorcycle at all, so I'm going to say 0 kilometers for a motorcycle. And for a car, I'm going to say, daily I drive about maybe 3 kilometers to work and back. I'm pretty lucky, but in order to go grocery shopping, I go to Dryden once every couple of weeks. So I'm going to say 150 kilometers week to average it out overall. What is your average fuel economy on your vehicle? Again, you can look this up in terms of what your vehicle is. I think that mine is somewhere around here. I don't quite remember. How often do you travel by car? When travel by car, how do you carpool? Occasionally. How far do you travel on public transportation each week? I don't, because we don't have access to public transportation. How many hours do you fly each year? I maybe 2, generally not at all, but some years I have to fly for some reason. This is also going to be more complicated, right? Because you're not, if you live in a northern community and you can only fly out, yes, that might be higher for you, but it is an essential reality. And then you can sign up for the newsletter if you want, or skip to your results, and you can see that I would use 3.8 Earths for my consumption of my carbon footprint. So in general, compared to other places, people in US average it's 5, in Brazil it's 1.8, so it really depends. If everybody lived with me, it would be April 6th. So then it's like, well, part of it is because of infrastructure, because I live in Canada, because of how things are shaped, it's not possible for me to have a smaller impact just in terms of how our society is. So then you can go into your details and you can look about land type, things that I use, consumption, food, mobility are the things that are the biggest for me. And you can get a little bit more information about that. And you can, how do you feel about that? And I think I feel helpless because I try. And then you can have some more information about what you can do about it. Anyway, it's a pretty cool site you can check out on your own time if you are interested. All right, so now you can answer the questions on page 38. Check your understanding question number 1, how the activities that help your impact your carbon footprint. You can, going through that quiz will help you sort of for personal if you'd like to do it. Okay, so then something I've sort of briefly touched on is carbon footprint inequities and how it isn't as straightforward as if we were all good people, none of us would have carbon footprints. That's not true at all. We live in an unjust world and there are definite inequities. So one thing that I just want to briefly talk about this is language challenges when we talk about this, because historically the language we've used has been oppressive. So like thinking about Canada as a first world country and say Ghana as a third world country. This puts countries and puts people on a hierarchy, and this is not helpful and not appropriate. So I'm not going to use the language of first world and third world countries. This may come up in resources, and that's not great, but we're also the language of developed versus developing. Again, puts the like Canada or places in Europe or the US are developed countries and therefore have got it figured out. We're better than places that are developing because it's putting a value system on what the westernized, which the Eurocentric world thinks is important, is what everyone should be achieving. And this is not true. Then also the global north versus global south is more other language that can be used, which continues to be a bit problematic because within the global north, there's still inequities, and it is not straightforward as that, and that to cut that line. Or more economically developed countries or less economically developed countries, that is problematic because places that we might deem as less economically developed have been pillaged, and all of their resources have been stolen by countries that are now seen as more economically developed. So the countries that are doing well, it is not because of anything. It's not because of the resources in our countries. It's because we've stolen them from other places, and through colonization, through slavery, that has set our countries up for success, and we've defined the system. And so again, this is problematic. So the same idea as rich countries and poor countries. Countries that are poor generally have had all of the resources stripped away and stolen by the countries that now we see as rich. This is same. So there's also other language that is problematic. It would be like Indian versus Native versus First Nations versus Indigenous. Obviously, using racist terms like Indian is not acceptable, though in our legislation in Canada, we still have the Indian Act. And so that language is still used there, though it is problematic and racist. That needs to be changed in order to actually represent our communities and are not represent the people who live in this area and who these policies are referring to. I generally use First Nation and Indigenous depending on the situation I'm talking about, and I work to use the most respectful language from the research that I've done. The same with in terms of looking at the world in general, talking about the global majority, because most people who within the world, there are more not white people than there are white people. So they are the global majority. And so instead of thinking of the minorities or marginalized communities, that is positioning white people as the focus, and that is inaccurate and continues to make systems of oppression like reinforce them. So again, language is complicated. I will do my best. Oh, right. Of course, this is also language development in terms of like colored person, African American, or Black. I will use Black as that again is the research that I've done is what those Black communities would like to be referred to. Same with using BIPOC, visual minorities, or BAME. Trying to use the language of global majority to really recognize that these people are not minorities, they are the majority of our world. So it's complicated. I will keep trying to do my best. All right, so we're gonna watch a video that explains climate justice, because this really shows how unfair climate change is, and I think that's a really important conversation to be having. So
hopefully we'll be able to get through it. I've got a couple of videos and they are not short, so we'll see. I have to pause.
Climate justice.
What do we want? Climate justice! Climate justice now.
Two words that we hear more and more.
But climate justice is linked to racial justice, social justice, and intergenerational justice too.
This is why we call not only for climate action, but climate justice.
Two words that could define the century.
There is no climate justice without racial justice. There is no climate justice without gender justice. There is no climate justice without queer justice.
what exactly does climate change have to do with justice? Aren't we all in this together? To understand climate justice, we need to understand climate injustice. Who causes climate change, and who's hurt by it? Let's first look at who's responsible for putting carbon dioxide into the atmosphere and heating the planet. Imagine this grain of rice is 1 ton of carbon dioxide. Each year, the average person in Nigeria adds less than 1 grain into the atmosphere. The average person in India, 2 grains. In China, 7 grains. In Germany, 10 grains. In the US, 17 grains. In 1 year, the average American pollutes 20 times more than the average Nigerian. But the problem with carbon is that it stays trapped in the atmosphere for centuries. So it's not just about how much we add each year. It's about how much has piled up over time. Since 1850, that adds up to about 1,500 gigatons. Okay, so we wanted to pour loads of these rice bags on the table to show you how big that really is, but after doing the math, we realized we need 3 million of them. Historical emissions matter today because countries are arguing about how soon they have to cut their net emissions down to 0. Big polluters like China, India, and Brazil look a lot less guilty when you consider they've only recently become part of the problem.
The tendency is to quote the annual emissions, but that doesn't tell us anything about, why we are in the current mess.
This is Prakash Kashwan, a political scientist researching climate justice. He says rich countries haven't accepted how unjust climate change really is.
It's mind-boggling, the kind of inequalities that have brought us to the current climate crisis. They're unbelievable and they aren't talked about enough.
In 2020, researchers calculated how far each country is responsible for pushing CO2 levels beyond a safe threshold that we crossed in 1990. The study takes into account how many people live in a country, how much they emitted throughout history, and includes emissions that cross borders through traded goods. The research shows that rich countries have outspent their carbon budgets. By a lot. The global north has emitted 92% of the CO2 that pushed the planet beyond safe levels. Asia, Africa, the Middle East and Latin America have emitted just 8%. Even a massive emitter like China is only just using up its carbon budget now. But if you live in a country that runs on fossil fuels, this doesn't mean climate change is your fault personally. But some of your choices do still make a difference. Because it's not just about where you live, but also how much you spend. The world's richest 1% emits twice as much as the poorest 50%, and those elites live all over the world. Unequal emissions are one big reason why climate activists are shouting about justice.
Everyone already is affected by the climate crisis, just on a very different scale. But if we look at the people ruling Germany and sitting at these decision tables for the past decades, they have not faced their responsibility.
They are destroying our environment. I think they need to act now, not later.
But hold up. CO2 heats the planet by the same amount whether it comes from Germany or Kenya. The climate doesn't care about geography. Well, geography cares about the climate. The second part of climate injustice is that even though poorer countries have done the least to change the climate, they're the ones getting hurt the most. Take heat waves and drought. Heat waves are becoming most unbearable across Africa, where droughts are even more punishing for crops. Then there's storms. Warmer air means that hurricanes and typhoons carry more energy and unleash more rain and stronger winds across the tropics. And by 2050, sea levels will have risen so high that floods which used to hit once a century will strike many coastal cities every single year. You can check out one of our other videos to see how some cities are trying to keep themselves afloat. The inequalities of climate change come together hardest in a country like India. Even though its people have barely contributed to global warming, they're among the most vulnerable. India's coastal cities are facing unprecedented floods while its rivers dry up, leaving farmers struggling to grow staples like rice and wheat.
India is one of the most inequitable countries in the world, and what we can see is that even if you take a city like Mumbai, when floods happen in the city, it's the poor that are the most impacted.
This is Payal Parekh, a climate scientist who campaigns full-time for climate justice.
Having grown up in a country like India, I grew up with inequality all around me. And this is essentially what it comes down to. The world is very unequal, and it's playing out in terms of climate change as well.
But that inequality is found within rich countries too. Black and brown people in countries like the US or the UK are typically poorer than white people. And that means they have less money to spend on air conditioning to adapt to heat waves or flood insurance to rebuild after storms. So, how can we make it fairer? Well, polluting countries can first turn off the CO2 tap and start removing their pollution from the atmosphere. Then they could pay reparations for using up more than their fair share of emissions. Some countries and companies are already doing something similar by paying poor countries to not chop down forests and instead plant trees. But instead of using that saved carbon to atone for their climate debts, they're using it as an excuse to keep on emitting.
So climate reparations have to be part of that discussion, and climate debt in particular is where we think about who is, we kind of divide up who is responsible for the kinds of ecological changes and climate changes we're seeing in societies, but also the kinds of climate-induced disasters that countries are facing.
This is Keston Perry, a political economist studying climate justice. He says reparations are needed to balance the scales, but that they won't be enough.
It is an interim measure. When I say that, I mean it has to be, we have to have a sort of much more longer term conversation around the economic system that we have nurtured and cultivated globally that have resulted in these kinds of disasters. And what do we do to not only reform that system, but absolutely overhaul it?
Reparations might sound radical, but rich countries already agreed to pay poorer ones to adapt to climate change. Imagine each of these Ps as $1 billion US. Rich countries promised 100 of them each year in climate finance by 2020. But it's 2021 and they haven't coughed up. In 2018, they gave 80 billion, but most of it was loans, not grants. UK-based charity Oxfam found that the real aid was actually closer to 20 billion.
Yearly, we have not been meeting the kinds of targets that even global north countries have set themselves. That finance mechanism is not meant to actually solve the problem.
Another approach takes climate justice more literally, holding polluters to account in court. After deadly wildfires tore through Portugal in 2017, 6 young activists took 33 industrial countries to the European Court of Human Rights for failing to cut their emissions quickly. They argued that the countries are discriminating against young people who'll have to live with the consequences of climate change. The verdict is still pending. In Germany and the Netherlands, High Court judges have ordered their governments to up their ambitions on cutting emissions. Activists also won a case against Royal Dutch Shell, forcing the company to pay for oil pollution, and are now demanding climate-friendly investments too.
So the basic legal argument for assigning responsibility is your contribution to the problem. So how much do you emit? How much do you contribute to climate change, greenhouse gas emissions? And what is the possibility for contributing to the solution?
The defendants argue that national courts don't have the right to rule on the climate because emissions and their impacts are global. But a new generation of activists are fighting for them to take exactly that responsibility and give them climate justice.
People have no idea how unjust the climate crisis is, and that's why we're making videos about it every Friday to help you understand. So if you like what you saw, then hit subscribe.
So that video really taps into the complexity of this issue and how it's not just about, again, the individual things that we can do. Yes, those have an impact, but how this is a global issue and how we need to be looking at it globally opposed to just personally. So just to recap again in terms of the the impact that individuals have. The richest 10% are responsible for almost half of the total lifestyle consumption and emissions. So many of us, we do not fall in the richest 10% of the world. This is like people who have ridiculous amounts of, like, billionaires. Many of us are going to be falling into the poorest 50%, and how those folks are within the world. So, I mean, living in Canada, we maybe are not in the poorest 50%. World incomes is complicated. But some of students may, but we're only contributing about 10%. Yet this is having a huge impact on our lives. So again, humans are mainly responsible for climate change, and different countries, different people think about that in different ways, in terms of who are making those changes and who are going to have an impact, who are going to change that. We also have to think about, the video helped us remember that we need to think about this historically. So it's not just about what's happening today, but it's what's happened in the last few hundreds of years. And places today might have a higher impact, but United States, the European Union, Russia, these places have had a big impact for a long time. And so therefore, though they might be making slight changes now, and pointing their fingers at other places that are having more emissions now, they've been having significant impacts for a long time. So that's how, thinking about in terms of injustice, about how the emissions, so that wealthy countries, European, American, Russian countries, Australia, these places are the places that are really having a big impact on climate change. But then looking in terms of risk, they are the places that have the least risk. They are Canada, United States, European countries, most of the European countries, Australia, Japan, New Zealand, these places are having the least risk. Yet places like many countries in Africa have the most risk. And so this red on this diagram, on this map, shows that in many places in Africa, many places in Southern Asia are the places that are having the most risk. All of these islands in Eurasia are, sorry, I can never remember what this area is called for something. My brain just blanks. These places are the places that are in danger as climate changes. As sea levels rise, these islands are going to be disappearing. As temperatures are higher, countries in Africa are going to have more and more droughts and less water. These are the places that have not been contributing to climate change. But again, as this is a global issue, the places that do contribute to climate change that are not dealing with the repercussions, and therefore are not making as much change that needs to happen. So I just really showing these are two maps that are next to each other to show. This is from 2011, so it's old, but it's probably still true. Even it might be more drastic, but I wasn't able to find more relevant or more recent maps. But this top map shows high emissions. So red is high emissions. You can see Canada, United States, Russia, Australia, parts of most of Europe have high emissions, are all red. And low emissions are Brazil, places in South America, most of African countries, India. All of these islands are all low emissions. Yet in this bottom map, we see the places that are going to have the biggest impact. So higher vulnerability are red. So those same places that are having the lowest emissions are the places that have the highest vulnerability, and the places that have low vulnerability are the places that have the high emissions, which is this is the really important thing about when we're talking about climate injustice. So now you can answer the key questions on page 40, the check understanding questions 1 and 2. So The next thing is to start thinking about reducing your carbon footprint. Unfortunately, we don't have time to watch these videos that I have right now. I'll try to integrate them into future lessons, but I'll also link them just so you can look at them if you are interested. Because it's really important to talk about individual and structural change and how all of that is interconnected. So individual, just a quick overview, even though we didn't get to look at the videos. But again, I will integrate them hopefully into another lesson really soon. Individual actions add up, but structural change is where we really need to be making a difference. So our highlights from today from carbon footprint lesson 5 is that carbon footprints measure the amount of greenhouse gas emissions produced, and you can have some personal reflection about your own impacts. Again, as many of our students are Indigenous and live in First Nation communities, your carbon footprint will be really quite different than mine in terms of how, as a white person who lives in a driving community, those are the ways that we use resources are different. And so that's also even within Canada, there's injustice in terms of how complicated this issue is and how it's not so super straightforward. So we talked about the inequities and how the white minority create the most emissions, but the global majority will be the most impacted, and how that's already happening now. We didn't get to talk about reducing carbon footprints and comparing individual impact and structural change. This is something that we will connect to in a future lesson. So hopefully with the success criteria, you can define carbon footprints and explain who has the greatest impacts, and you can explain climate injustices. And in the future, we will talk about how carbon footprints can be reduced. You're now able to do the majority of the review questions on page 43, questions 1 through 12. And again, we will continue to talk about ways that we can reduce our carbon footprints in the future. All right, if you have any questions, please reach out and contact me as always. Call me at the office at 807-737-1488, extension 2209. Sorry. Anyway, you can email me at bronwyn.slate@nnec.on.ca or connect with me through Facebook at bslateWahsa. As always, our lessons are always put up on YouTube, and their videos are all there as well, so that you can watch them again and connect to other those original sources, so that you can connect with other videos if you're interested in learning more. Thank you so much for joining me. I hope you have a lovely day. Mwich.